Oh, nice boy. Oh, nice boy. Look, stick. Stick, stupid. That's a stick, boy. Look at this. Yes. You like your stick? You want to get it? And no wonder you're extinct.
Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with another episode of Aurora Park. For this episode, the subject matter is going to be this Atlantis reissue of the vintage Aurora M115 8-inch howitzer. The model that you see here is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. Although this model here is slightly outside of that purview, I do often at times take commission build projects for vehicles in the 1/48 scale range. However, for pricing and availability information, that would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. This model here is built predominantly out of the box, and we'll be going over all of the kit's features as well as giving the model a thorough in-box review. Stay tuned because there's going to be a bit of info coming right at you. To start this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this artillery piece here is the M115 8-inch howitzer, or perhaps you could call it the M1 8-inch howitzer. That's an interesting conundrum that we'll be touching upon momentarily. This unit has its roots with the US military designing it in the late 1930s. Fast forward to 1942, the unit was adopted and entered into service as well as also into full production. The unit, when it originally adopted, was designated the M1 8-inch howitzer. Yes, there's yet another M1 in the US military's catalog system. As one would imagine, this is one of the larger heavy artillery pieces that were fielded by the US during World War II, being 8 inches in caliber or 203 millimeters for the metric inclined. Just like with other heavy, larger caliber howitzers and artillery systems, this unit here utilized a two-piece ammunition type format, where we have the projectile and then we have a separate powder charge. However, unlike some of the German heavy artillery pieces where they have the propellant in a large brass canister, the M1 or the M115 howitzer utilized a canvas bag that contained the propellant, which is something that you generally see more or less on naval vessels. Obviously, when the unit is fired, the canvas completely incinerates and it leaves for a shellless, caseless type setup. Because of the unit's heavy caliber, it utilizes an interrupted thread type design for the breech. This is something that is also generally seen on more heavier caliber artillery pieces, as opposed to a sliding breech type design, which is generally seen on smaller artillery pieces. Such things as like 75 or even the 88 millimeters come to mind. Because of the heavy caliber, this unit does utilize a hydro-pneumatic system to mitigate the recoil, which is again something that is quite commonly seen on other artillery units, both large and small. In addition to that, another conventional system that this unit does have is the split trail design found on the Carriage. Because this is obviously a towed artillery piece, it needs to have the ability to be mobile, and in order to do this, it utilizes this very elaborate Carriage suspension design that incorporates 10 large truck wheels. The unit is unique because the whole carriage itself is designed to elevate and pivot out of the way when the unit is being mounted into the ground in order to firmly set it in place in order to get it ready for its firing position. However, in a relatively quick period of time, the unit can be remounted into its transport mode and then towed away to the next position where it needs to be redeployed. As I mentioned before, the unit was widely utilized by the US military during World War II, and about 1,000 and some change were produced in all from 1942 to about 1945. However, the system was very adaptable, and several other units were developed with both longer barrels as well as in a self-propelled type format. Namely, during World War II, we had the M40, where it paired this unit on top of a modified HVSS equipped Sherman tank, and then post World War II you would see vehicles like the M107 or the M110, and those saw service all throughout the 1970s and all the way up until around the early portion of the 1990s time frame. As for the 8-inch howitzer itself, this again was still in active Army service even post-World War II. It saw service in Korea as well as also in Vietnam. I believe it wasn't until the late 70s or into the 80s when the M115 was finally eventually retired from U.S. military service. However, just because it was retired by the U.S. military, that's not the end of this unit's story. The M115, which by the way, the U.S. military themselves redesignated it as the M115 in the early 1960s timeframe, I believe to better fit with NATO standardization, if I'm not mistaken. But regardless, at this point, the M115 was widely exported to many other NATO countries, and it saw service with the West German Bundeswehr, along with other countries such as Pakistan and many, many more. A lot of these countries still utilize the M115 howitzer to this very day. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when this model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this 148 scale Atlantis reissue of the Aurora 8-inch howitzer. As I touched upon in the other Atlantis build videos that are found on the channel, Atlantis is a relatively new model kit company to the market. They've only been around for about 3 or 4 years or so. And what's unique about them is they are re-releasing old vintage model kits from the 1950s era. The kits that I'm going to be focusing on, or I have been focusing on, are the re-releases of the old kits from the company Aurora. The Aurora Plastic Model Company was a really big company back in the 1950s, 1960s, and even into the 1970s timeframe, where they released a large number of very popular and iconic kits of the period that were mostly of airplanes and the Monster and Hollywood type figurine sets that were out at that period. In addition to those lines, they also had quite an expansive and unique line of military vehicle models, and this 8-inch howitzer here was one of them. As I touched upon in the other Atlantis videos, Aurora itself went out of business in the mid to late 1970s timeframe for a multitude of reasons. If anyone is interested to know more information about that, I recommend checking out the YouTube channel Max's Models. He has a really good in-depth story on the Aurora Model Company. Regardless, right after that era, into the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, the Aurora kits became this mythical beast where they were very, very sought after, and because of which they were very expensive. It wasn't uncommon to see these kits in brand new condition run anywhere between $100 to $200 at times, so they were something that was mostly look but don't touch. Well, to Atlantis' credit, they somehow were able to obtain the original tooling from Aurora, or possibly just reverse engineer some other tooling from Aurora, and re-release the models back in their original format. What's also cool about the Atlantis kits is that they are extremely affordable compared to some of the other kits on the market. Some other noteworthy things to mention about the Atlantis kits is that they have resurrected the old box arts, which were honestly the best part of the Aurora models of the time, and the kits are made entirely in the US, which is also something that's sadly needs to be noteworthy, but it is something that's really cool nonetheless that they do. As for tracking these models down, they are something that are generally found in some kind of a retail setting. For instance, my local Hobby Lobbies were the first vendor that I saw that actually had them in stock. However, the kits that I've seen in Hobby Lobby were not this particular one here, and they were exclusively the M46 patent. I go over that in more depth in that video. This one here I've yet to see actually in any store setting, but this particular model is extremely easy to come by because I picked it up from Amazon.com. In addition to Amazon.com, you can also pick these kits up from the Atlantis website, which is found on the URLs that are found on the box, as well as also you'll see it listed below in the video description. This model here, I purchased it about a year ago for $19 US, and so I think it's safe to say it's a good idea that I finally get to it. Because it's only been sitting in the stash for about a year, there's practically nothing on the surface, which is something that's a little bit unique usually on these old stash inhabitant type videos. But outside of that, here you get to see the models with the box art. Like I stated before, this model here gives you the original box art found on the Aurora kit. This kit here has the box art from the original 1958 release. as I mentioned in the other Aurora videos, over the years, Aurora would revise their box arts from time to time for one reason or another, either because they needed to recrop the box or for some other reason. And there was an alternative version of this exact box art that I'll show in a second. And honestly, in my opinion, that should have been the one they went with, but that's more or less personal choice. However, before we can actually see the box art, it's kind of hard to do with the original cellophane on, which is adding a bit of glare. So I'm going to go ahead and puncture through the cellophane here, just so that I could get access to the inner contents. Ah, that's better. So, with the cellophane off, you get a better look of the box art in question. The original release would have had some typography in the Aurora logo scattered amongst the various corners of the box, or the packaging, I should say. And on the Aurora, or I should say on the Atlantis re-release here, they went with the format where they left the box art completely intact, and they just put all their information on a banner running across the top, leaving for the box art to be left completely intact, which is actually a nice feature. As for the box art itself, it's painted by that artist that I mentioned in the other Aurora videos, and the box art is nicely rendered. You can see that it's the 8-inch howitzer during a firing type setup. You have two other individuals over there with a map, making sure that they're not pulling a mulligan and bombing the wrong place. And we have some scattered shell casings on the floor and all that good stuff. The remainder of the graphic design takes it to the Atlantis verbiage that I touched upon before. The typography is pretty simple on these Atlantis kits. Just tells you everything you need to know in some basic stencil type font. No frills. What you need to know. It's easily legible. The model, of course, is made in the US, like I touched upon before, and the model's skill level is number 2, so I'm pretty sure I could be able to tackle it. I do build armor techs after all. And of course, the model is 1/48 scale, which is something, by the way, that's really interesting about the Aurora kits themselves. They were all 1/48 scale, and this is something that's unique to mention because if anyone's a fan of my other vintage tank build videos, you'll know that during the 1950s period and even into the 60s, there wasn't really an established scale amongst companies. You have companies like Monogram or Revell, and Renwall's another one, where they would release kits and they'd be in a smattering of different scales. Some would be 1/32, some would be 1/30, some would be 1/50, and it wasn't really until the 1970s was when an established 1/35 scale would become prominent, and that would be the de facto scale of tank kits for, you know, the rest of the time frame, even up until today. 1/48 scale is more of a boutique type scale. It was, again, the official scale of the Aurora kits, and it wouldn't be until the 60s when the Japanese would jump on that too, where they would be releasing kits in the same scale, and most notably this would be Bandai. And I've done a few Bandai 1/48 scale kits on the channel, and they're also really interesting and cool in their own right. 1/48 scale, it's another one of those scales that comes in and out of fashion every so often, and it seems like we're on the cusp again of 1/48 making a renaissance, because I just saw on some modeling Facebook feed that TACOM has a full interior Tiger 1 coming out in 1/48 scale. Much along the lines of the Bandai one. It's basically the same kit, just, you know, massively evolved, you know, to its current super kit status. But that is something interesting to point out. So these kits here, some of the Aurora kits are oddly enough just as relevant today in the year 2022 as they were back in the 1950s when they came out, because a lot of the kits have yet to have been reproduced by some other super kit or contemporary type kit, you know, manufacturer, which is something else you don't really see all that often. So back to the graphic design. Here we have some corporate information. It's interesting because the layout here is very monogram-ish, and I have mentioned this in a few other videos. I'm not sure if Monogram does the molding or if they have a deal with Monogram. It's just, if you ever seen any of the Monogram kits, they have a format here which is very similar. While on the topic of Monogram, it is important to point out that a large number of the old Aurora kits were acquired by Monogram in the 1970s when the Aurora company went defunct and their assets were sold off. So perhaps Monogram were holding on to these molds for this entire time and Atlantis got access to them, or possibly Atlantis and Monogram have a deal with one another for the manufacturing. Not really sure, it's more or less speculative, but if anyone does know, feel free to put that in the comment section listed below. Back to the graphic design, here we have the side tab, which is quite typical for these kits. We have a smaller thumbnail of the same box art on the front, as well as the banner here with the Atlantis verbiage continuing. It is a mirror image on the opposite side. And right here on this tab, we have some more interesting info. We have a sample picture of a built unit. I'm not sure if this is a newly built model or if it's just an old stock photograph from the old original Aurora one that was put here on the side, because this was done, I believe, on the Joseph Stalin 3 kit that I referenced or I built a little while ago. Of course, that video can be found on the channel too. Here we have a barcode, some more corporate info, and something that's really cool. As I alluded to before, this here was not the only box art that was made for this kit. The other one was this particular version here, and as I stated before, in my opinion, this should have been the box art Atlantis should have went with, because I just prefer this one to the other one. Even though it's not as action-packed, there's just something about this artist's work. I always just love the way he would render things out, and this one here just screams that type of illustration style. But alas, that's just my personal opinion. On the bottom portion here, we just have some more corporate info. We have the website, atlantis-models.com, which, by the way, they still are re-releasing new kits, and there are a few that they added to the market, which is also something that's pretty cool. And as the channel moves on, I'm more than likely going to be acquiring more of them, and we'll be doing videos like this one here. But, of course, more of that information is to come. This kit here, by the way, was released back in 2019, and as far as I know, it's still in production and is still relatively easily tracked down on places not only like Amazon, but other retailers like eBay, and I'm pretty sure a good Google search should yield for some pretty decent results. So, cracking open the kit contents, you will find a lot of photo etch and turned brass, and no, I'm just fooling around. This thing is as vintage as a model kit can possibly get. Everything here is made in injection molded plastic, as it was back in the late 1950s when this kit was originally designed. So with the box opened up, here we have all the components for this kit nicely sealed in this bag here, which again is something that's quite typically done with several other makers on the market. Monogram is, again, one of them, as I've touched upon in the Screaming Mimi Sherman video and even the M48A2 videos. Alright, so dumping out the kit contents. The kit does have quite a bit of components on it, which is not too unsurprising because, you know, this is a howitzer and they tend to be fairly complex with the parts that are needed to assemble, so. Okay, so that's everything out of the bag. I could just put that aside for now. All of the components are molded in this dark olive drab type plastic coloring, which is true to form to the originals. The originals did have a color very similar to this, if not almost identical. Of all of the monogram kits, or I should say monogram, of all the Aurora kits that I've seen and worked on in the past, this one here is very, very close to one of those original examples. Sadly, unlike the M26 or the JS3, where I had an original example of a OG Aurora kit, for the howitzer here, that's not the case. So this one here, I'm going to be basically, it's going to be my first time even looking at one in kit form. So we're going to be exploring this all together. So this first runner here takes us to the bottom base portion, and the 8-inch howitzer does have this very elaborate type main chunk. We have several other components which appear to me to be the shocks, or not shocks, they're the hydraulics that support the upper carriage to the lower portion of the carriage. They look to be a two-piece assembly, and judging by this ram over here, the pieces should have some functionality to it. This is something that I've seen before on other vehicles that are armed with a similar type of system, such as the Aurora M115 series comes to mind, and even the AFV Club, what the hell was it? The, what is it? This is going to kill me. It was the one where it was a Sherman, it was an HVSS Sherman body with a long tom on it. The M40. That's right, the M40 self-propelled gun. That would literally have killed me. Anyway, yeah, all of those mentioned kits do have a system similar to this with how the elevation system works. The remainder of the details are decently rendered on. There's not really a whole lot of flash on the majority of the components. The handles here does have a small little bit of flash, but again, this is quite typical for models of this vintage. I mean, we're talking about a kit that was around when basically Sputnik was, you know, in orbit. So you have to give it some leeway. If anyone's used to working on modern super kits, this is actually pretty good for an older style kit like we're dealing with here. The next runner consists of these pieces here. These are the main legs that expand and dig into the ground. I have a AFV Club 8-inch howitzer kit, and I have looked at it from time to time, so a lot of the parts here do look very familiar, which is to Aurora's credit, like this component over here, as well as the breech and other fittings. So again, to Aurora's credit, if it, so far it's passing the look test, and that's definitely something that is noteworthy. The breech is very similar to some of the more modern kits that I mentioned before, where it is rendered in 2 halves, and of course there's going to be a little bit of seam work over there, but that again comes with the territory. Here we have all of the wheels. They do have some fastener and hubcap detailing rendered on. Hopefully that could get into focus. For the scale that these pieces are rendered in, the details are actually pretty decent, I must say. The bottom portion of the legs are hollow. Not too surprising. This may or may not be something I address when I get to the build, so we'll see how that pans out. This runner here consists of, well, the main barrel segment, and just like the Italeri kit, it is in 2 sections, as was again on the AFV Club one. The only difference on those ones, the end of the barrel and the main section over here were 2 separate parts because they had different like barrel assemblies for different kits, but again, it's still very reminiscent of those. We have some suspension parts over here, which are consisting of leaf springs and some other connecting rods. And even though the Aurora piece here simplified them quite a bit, in my opinion, they still do the job quite well, and I'm not seeing or predicting any problems with the assembly on this. We have some other various components here, which elude me to what they are at the moment. I've yet to really build a towed version of the 8-inch. I have, like I say, a kit one, but I've yet to actually assemble it. I was saving it for something special. But regardless, we'll see how that pans out as the build commences. So here we have some more components. We have a crew member, which I'm not going to use. I don't paint figures, so this little guy sadly is going to spend his time in the figure bin. And we have some other components, a drawbar here. We have a elevation gear for the bottom of the carriage, and a bunch of other little gizmos, which, well, I know what that is. That's actually the little hydraulic system that's found on the breech, and there's probably the breech lever right there, if I was to take a guess. I want to say it's an optic, but no, it's a lever of some sort. We'll see how that works out. And we got some loose bits here, because every good old kit would have some parts loose. We have some figures doing random things, which is great if you're into that. This is great, by the way, for a diorama. That's a potential recommendation, which I will be revisiting again towards the end of the video. All right, so we have here the main carriage, which is a 2-part assembly, and just like many of the other larger scale kits of this type of piece, they have all of their details integrally molded into the sides, which if you've ever seen a real one, it's just jam-packed with stuff going on. This one here is probably a little bit simplified, but again, I don't see why it can't do the job. And here go the side sections of the actual carriage. And the Aurora kit is decently rendered, I will say. They have all of the angled rigidity ribs integrally molded on, as well as several other elevation crank and gearbox details. And if anyone has ever worked on those other kits or seen one of these real units, you could basically identify what you're looking at here, which is, again, a sign that you did something right. The pieces are pretty thick with their molding, which is quite common on these older kits. It makes the pieces easy to mold, but also makes the parts more robust. And a lot of these older kits here, they did have some functionality in mind for them, and the thickness of the parts does lend itself to that. Okay, the next large part here is, I believe, the top or the bottom portion of that main cluster housing that I mentioned earlier on. Pretty simple for what it is. Now, there is a small little blister down here. If I didn't know any better, I'd say this is probably where the original Aurora molding information would have been. And Atlantis just, or Monogram, or whoever just, milled it out on this blister that we have. This may or may not be something I address. This appears to be on the bottom of the unit, or maybe, I think it's actually on the inside of the unit. So if that's the case, it's probably totally irrelevant to try to alter it. But we'll see, how that pans out as the build goes on. And we have some other various miscellaneous bits that are the type of things that you'll lose and then you'll pull your hair out of your head. So we have what appears to be some kind of a suspension type part, some kind of swing arm. There's 2 of them right here. A pin, which probably is going to be holding the entire thing together. Just taking a guess. Some other yoke cradle, probably wheel type device. This is, again, some kind of elevation pin. I'll also take a guess. And some other shelf-type gizmos. And a tire running around loose, or a rim running around loose. I will say that, again, compared to the other Atlantis reissues that I've seen, this one seems to be really neatly molded, and the parts are really clean, so which is, again, a huge plus for this kit over here. The final runner to mention is the tires, and what's really cool is that the tires are made in, well, real rubber tires, so that's fantastic. The rubber material is always a great thing on models that have a wheel type format. I always personally enjoy rubber as opposed to trying to paint plastic, and this is something that is, again, it's a nice attribute that this kit has, and of course this is true again for the original Aurora. So that's another plus that the kit does have. Digging further in the box, we have here a set of water slide decals. They're a bit monogram-ish in terms of quality, which means they look a bit shiny right now, but I've had some pretty good results with them on past builds, and I'm predicting a similar type of result with this one here. So again, we'll see as the build turns on. The decals are pretty basic, as one would imagine for an older kit. We have some stars, a giant US Army marking on them, as well as some other type of stuff going on. Some looks like TO&E numbers of one flavor or another. Again, quite customary for something like this from this era. And here we have the instruction sheet. Again, very monogram-ish in its overall layout. The inside here looks to have original scans of the old Aurora instructions, which is something that's pretty cool. The other examples of the Atlantis kits that I built in the past didn't have that. They were basically just modern drawings or, drafted type illustrations compared to these ones here, which they are old school. If any younger person here is watching this and wondering what instructions look like back in the day, yeah, this is what you got. So it's kind of funny when people complain about like the dragon instructions. Oh, they were just so terrible. Yeah, try building an old school Aurora kit and get back to me. But fortunately, these pieces are so simple and the parts counts are so low that something like this is more than suffice for the job at hand. So again, it's just some more of that little nostalgia thing that any boomer out there who built these old Auroras, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So here's the model during the construction, and at this point here, the majority of the sub-assemblies have been assembled, and from this point onward I could continue it, but I'm going to need to do some preliminary painting. This is because of some of the recesses that are found in some of the locations. If I go ahead and just fully complete it without getting paint in those areas, it's going to be really difficult, if not impossible, to get paint in these areas once the model progresses past this point. And by the way, this isn't just exclusive to the old Aurora 8-inch howitzer over here, but the same exact techniques I would utilize on any other vehicles or I should say any other artillery pieces in this type of format. So if we can rewind on the Hummel, the Nashorn, and the M40, all of those vehicles, basically you would be following a similar format for really the same reasons. So back to the parts that we have here. At this time, I might as well go over some of these locations, because once the model's fully painted and weathered, obviously you're not going to be able to see what work went into them at that point. So starting with the main barrel assembly, here you can see what it looks like with all the kit components affixed in place. Both the barrel assembly and the breech assembly are a two-piece assembly, which means there are some seam work to contend with. The fit on the parts was actually pretty good, and again, considering that this is a vintage kit that was designed in the 50s, for the pieces to line up and blend away without changing the circumference on the areas is actually something that's very noteworthy. I found that the pieces, yeah, they go together just fine, and then with a little bit of super glue and a little bit of sanding, that's really all that's required to polish them down to the configuration that we see here. As you can also see, the breech block is fully functional. There isn't any real breech detailing on the inside with the locking lugs or anything. However, again, considering the vintage of the kit, the fact that the piece is functional is actually something that I do enjoy. On the inner portion over here, on my example, there was a sinkhole found in this area, which was simply plugged up with some red putty and then sanded flush. Sinkholes like this are something that's going to be expected on tooling of this vintage, and this is something that I've encountered on several of the other Atlantis or Aurora re-release models, but again, it comes with the territory. So it wasn't too much of a surprise to find it on that part there. I will say, though, that in terms of sink marks on this particular kit here, the sink marks are really, really rare, and the only place where I encountered it was in that location that I just mentioned. Going back to the rear area over here, the components are the kit supply ones. However, the instructions are quite vague on their actual physical location, which again comes with the territory on a kit of this vintage. Fortunately for me, I had a AFV Club 8-inch Howitzer 1/35 scale kit in my stash, so I was able to take out the instructions and cross-reference them with the parts that we have here in order to get the components fitted to the locations that we see. What appears to be some kind of a, it's like an actuator, it's kind of like the thing on the back of your car in the trunk or under the hood. It's found in this area here on the 8-inch Howitzer. However, the kit is very vague on whether you put it on this area or that area, but with the way you see it here was exactly how I lifted it from the AFV Club instructions. Also, the locking lever, the kit wants you to install this in reverse, and this is just a simple thing to correct. You just rotate it and you mount it in the position that we have here, which again is as per the other example I was referencing. So starting with the front of the unit takes us to the suspension, and the M115 Howitzer does indeed have a suspension. What's really interesting about the real unit is that the entire suspension itself is actually connected to these two large threaded type rods, and with a wrench you loosen or tighten these two sections, and this will raise or lower the carriage from the ground. Obviously, this is done for transport and for firing. When you're in transport mode, you want to have the unit jacked up so that the wheels can spin freely. But when you want to deploy the howitzer, these get tightened all the way up where the wheels are not making contact with the ground. The main base of the body is, and that's how the unit really gets anchored in place. In addition to that interesting feature, the Carriage does have some handbrakes on it, as well as also a leaf spring suspension. All of these mentioned details are present on the Aurora or the Atlantis kit, and they do go together pretty easily. Even though the instructions are as primitive as they are, you do get a pretty good idea on where the parts do go. So on this particular kit's suspension over here, it is comprised of a number of different components, and it's probably the most intricate part of this entire build. And with the way the part is designed, it does simplify immensely the construction because everything is molded in large segments that have all the smaller sub-assemblies integrally molded on. This is definitely true over here. You can see with the leaf springs, along with those two little guide rods that are found right here on the top sections. Same is also true for the handbrakes and also those threaded rod details that I mentioned before. One nice thing that I found about the kit, and this is something that I'm not sure if the kit was originally intended for this or if it's just something that I hacked while during building it, is that if you don't apply the glue to a certain location, you can actually have the suspension be somewhat functional, like you see right here. The way this is done is on the bottom portion over here, you will see these two pegs that emerge from the bottom base. These two pegs are what the leaf springs will then connect to. Now, if you're going through the momentum of the build, you may feel inclined to add a drop of glue to these two sections, and if you do, the suspension, or I should say the wheels, are going to be permanently set in one position. However, if you do not add the glue to those two small locations, you will then have the ability to have the suspension be forfeiting, like you see on my model over here. You do have to be careful though, because if the glue isn't on those sections, the leaf springs may have the tendency of working themselves loose because they are only glued on in some small locations here on the front and rear portions of the axle. But if you're careful enough, yeah, you could definitely achieve the same effect that I did on this model over here, where you do have a semi-functional suspension without really doing any extra modifications to the model. From the suspension takes to the remainder of the wheels, and like I stated earlier, I really like the way they were executed on this kit. The tires are actual molded rubber tires, which is always an excellent feature, and it's one that I always personally appreciated on my wheeled vehicle models. The rims are also decently rendered. They get the job done pretty well, and the assembly is also very easily done as well. The installation is pretty straightforward. Once the wheels are fully assembled, they just snap into their appropriate location on the axles without any sort of extra manhandling required. They are the type of assembly that once they get installed into place, you're not going to be able to pull them out. So it's the type of thing that when you're ready to commit, make sure you're ready to commit, because once these wheels get put on place, you're just going to end up breaking them if for whatever reason you need to remove them. And that's basically all there is for the suspension on the main howitzer itself. And this takes us to the little carriage. And this is something that is very interesting. And the execution on this kit is also pretty nicely done. In order for the unit to be towed, obviously you have the wheels in the front that are facilitating that roll. But for the back, the entire unit is basically jacked up on this little dolly that we have right here. The dolly itself is fully articulating in that it can pivot like this, and this is what actually connects to the tow hitch found on the deuce and a half, the prime mover, or even a Cat D4 bulldozer. Whatever is going to be towing this thing, this is the bit of equipment there that's going to facilitate that. And with the way the kit is designed, it's actually, again, pretty well engineered, but it can use a little bit of improvement in order to make it just a little bit more robust. So I'll first start with the detailing here. We have this interesting handbrake setup, and this was something that was a little bit vague on the instruction sheet, and was something I was able to verify from pictures of the real M115 and also again from the AFV instructions. But this is the layout, or I should say the orientation, I was able to come up with from the little bit of research I was conducting. Outside of that, the wheels, again, same quality as the ones on the Carriage. They just assemble, then snap into place. And once they are assembled, you can see the detailing on the lug nuts and the rims themselves. Again, pretty nicely done, specifically for the scale and also for the age of the tooling. Honestly, it aged very well. The next thing to mention is how it would pivot or connect to the howitzer itself, and I will go over the transformation process as the video goes on. But the way the kit is designed, we have a ball and socket type system, and this unit here will simply plug into the axle section, and this will give you the pivot so that this thing can pivot well around corners. The system does work pretty good. However, it is a bit on the frail side with the way the kit is designed, and if you're assembling the model, the tolerances are just not going to be to the point where you just snap it together and it stays there, and the piece is going to want to fall out constantly. So what you can do is twofold. You can either just glue it together as one solid unit, which will work, but that's really more or less the cop-out way of doing it. In order to keep the piece functional, like I did over here, I did one very simple trick. With a pin vise, I drilled out the center portion right over there, as well as a corresponding section right here on this pivoting section. If I can recall, I believe there was even a hole already molded into these two sections over here, so the alignment was something that was really easily done. But regardless, once the holes were drilled, I then took a metal wire brad and I glued it into the top portion over here. And once the glue sets, this now acts as the pivot point, and the piece pivots very, very easy, very freely, and most importantly, it's on permanently and it'll never fall out. From the rear dolly takes us back to the actual carriage and base of the unit itself. And this is where we get to see some of the functionality taking shape. So as you can clearly see, the legs are very easily functional. They swing open, they stop at the right locations with almost no hand fitting required, and the piece goes together very quickly and effortlessly. On the bottom portions here, like I mentioned before, there is a wide open cavity found in these areas, and I addressed it by filling these in with cast resin and then just polishing everything smooth with some sandpaper. And once the unit's fully painted, you can see just how well everything blended together. Obviously, this is a really easy way to enhance the model from the original kit condition. The next thing I want to mention are with the spades that we have right here in the back. Obviously, these are used to dig the unit into the ground so that when the unit recoils from firing, the unit, or I should say the tail section, digs into the dirt and it prevents the unit from moving around. Quite customarily seen on basically any towed artillery piece. But on the M115 howitzer over here, these units are actually able to disconnect in order to convert the unit into its transport mode. And true to form on the model here, it can do just that. The way you see these sections, they are not glued in place and are purely just held on with friction, as you can see what I've just done now. In order to secure them in place, they are stowed with these two little bracket sections that we have right here and here. And they will line up by inserting into these little sections. And once they are in place, they are held and the piece holds them very nicely and pretty snugly. So snug that you may potentially break them if you are not careful, but if you play your cards right, the units should be able to mount into their appropriate locations in the stowed mode without any issues. And that's just one of the little dig-in sections. The other ones are right here on the sides of the arms. These two are also fully removable and are just purely held on with friction. Fortunately, the paint is not exactly allowing me to move them too much, but rest assured they are not glued on in place and are just purely held on with friction. These two are also used to thoroughly dig the unit into place during its firing mode of operation. On the side portion here of the legs, you can see the large wrench, and there should be one on either side, which is again true to form to the real one. These large wrenches are used to tighten down or loosen the threaded rods that I touched upon before, found right there on the front, in order to raise or lower the front suspension. And while on that note, you can see that with a swipe of silver paint, I applied it to the thread section, which obviously paint would not last on these areas very long, specifically when the unit is in operation. One thing that I personally appreciate about the model is that they did render on the little threads, which would be appropriate for these sections. So a little swipe of silver paint over there is really all that you need to enhance the piece further. Moving upward takes to the main carriage assembly, and I'll start first with the elevation. The elevation obviously works very, very well, and the piece performs very fluidly. On the front area, you can see the elevation gear detailing, and I went ahead and painted that with silver paint, as again, just like with the threads on the front suspension, this section would not have paint lasting on it very long, specifically in operation. Same is also true for what would be a gear found on the real unit, but on this one here, it's just a stylized little cylinder, but again, a little swipe of silver paint. It's really all that's required to just make the piece that much more highlighted. Also, one other cool thing to mention is with the elevation, you can see how it works with the assist springs found on these two sections over here. And everything operates in unison very fluidly and simply. And again, this is as per the original kit. Of course, you want to have a little swipe of silver paint in these two sections over here because, as one might imagine, they wouldn't exactly have paint on them in operation. In addition to the elevation, the entire unit can pivot left and right, as it would on the real unit. And on the model over here, it performs very, very well. Just the one thing I want to mention is that there is no physical pin or retention system that's keeping it in place, and it's purely just held on there with friction. The friction fit does work very well, obviously. You can see I can pick the whole unit up from the carriage and it's not going to fall off or wiggle loose, but this is something to consider when you're working on your model. You may want to keep pivoting at a bare minimum. However, for you to pivot this thing enough times for that plastic to wear out, for the piece to, pop out, you're really playing with these things quite a bit. In that case, you're really getting your money's worth out of it. And also, in that case, you're going to be missing a bunch of other parts, so if that happens, it's going to be the least of your problems. Regardless, though, it does hold it on very well from what I can see, in my opinion. One thing that I do want to mention is the top portion over here, there's a small little handle type fitting, and this was something that was breaking off constantly during the course of the build. With the way the piece is, it is a two-piece assembly, so you are going to go in there with some seam removal type techniques, and that little handle can easily be broken off, and it's very susceptible to that type of a problem. On mine here, I believe the one that you see is actually made from a thin piece of wire that was fastened to the, or I should say shaped to the same geometry as what it would be on the real unit, and then was just mounted in place. That's really the only extra detailing that I physically scratch built on this model, and once that little piece was added, it definitely blends in with the remainder of the detailing found on the piece. Moving rearward takes us to the breech, and as you can see, it is fully functional, or in this case, it's a little too fully functional, and the piece just wants to swing open very, very easily. On this one here, I didn't add any sort of breech detailing with the locking lugs, which would be present on the actual unit, but for this example over here, the stock way was perfectly suffice. The unit, like I mentioned before, I did have to glue some of the parts on incorrectly according to the instructions in order to get it to look more like the actual unit, which again I referenced earlier on in the video. But now that everything is completed, you can see exactly what I was referring to. Also, with that small little assist ram that we have right over here, again, a nice little swipe of silver paint was used in order to give just a little bit more extra detail pop for this area. Moving upward from the breech to the remainder of the assembly, and on this section over here, this is one thing I want to point out that was probably the most amount of work required for this build. Not so much with getting the parts to fit and line up, that was actually very easily done, but just like what is common on all units of the same pattern, you will have a seam to deal with in this section over here because it is a two-piece assembly. Fortunately, this is very easily polished away with just some basic modeling techniques. Of course, I'm referencing the use of super glue and some sandpaper. A needle file can also come in handy for this type of procedure over here. But regardless, once you're done with the sanding, you'll see that the component is completely seamless, which again is exactly the look that you're going for. And on a unit like this, and this is again true for all pieces of towed artillery, this is the biggest area to watch out for because it's also the biggest focal point on the build. On the M115, there are several step-down sections found on these areas here and here. And of course, this is something that you do have to pay attention to when you're doing the seam removal because you don't want to over-polish or polish unevenly. So once you have those fundamentals ironed out, the remainder of the polish work goes by very quickly. So as I referenced earlier, this kit can be rendered either in the towed state or in the deployed state. But you can also have the model built in a way where it can be rendered in either way. And that's something that I always particularly found interesting about this kit and also the other vintage kits from this era. There was a lot of functionality built into them back in that era, as opposed to nowadays where, you know, you basically just pick one or the other. So on this model over here, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put the spades back into their stowed location, which again, they just slide directly in like that. I'll do the same thing with this one over here. They go on pretty easily, but again, you know, with everything painted and everything, you want to be careful. At that point there, you can see that they're held in place pretty firmly. The next thing to do is to hook up the legs and pin them to the little carriage. And the way this is done is with those holes, or I should say those slots that I touched upon before. Well, now those slots are going to be plugged into this section over here found on the dolly. And this unit over here, these two holes are going to line up with the hole here found on that tombstone shaped like object. Everything just lines up accordingly. At that point, we then have this little pin, which again is kit supplied, and it's just going to be used to, well, pin everything together. The holes do line up, it's just a little tricky to get on camera, but as you can see, the pin does get inserted into place. At that point there, the unit is now in its towed condition. The next thing I want to mention is with this device that we have right over here. And this is something that I'm actually not sure if the M115 Howitzer even gets. As I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong out there, any red light out there, but I believe that this here is something that is intended for the long tom, which essentially is the exact same system as this here, only the barrel is much longer. i.e. the name. Regardless, this component is supplied with the Aurora, or in this case, the Atlantis set. And the way this works is this would actually just get lined up into this location over here. And it does hold it pretty well, but one quick modification that I made in order to lock it up further is with this area here. You can see that I went ahead and added some holes with the pin vise, and I drilled 2 corresponding holes found in this section here of the A-frame. Note, by the way, that we have this little notch over here. It's going to come important when you see the orientation of the piece, but basically this lines up in this area like so. And then I have these 2 wire brads that get inserted into these locations. And once in place, they lock it up further. Once the pins are in place, the unit is now completely tied down, and you not have to worry about it opening up. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that that little notch over there is meant for when this thing is in transport mode. It's actually in the recoiled state, and it stays in this position that we have right over here, and the breech lines up with that little notch cutout found on the component. What's interesting to point out is that I have been doing a bit of research on the M115 in recent years for a project that may or may not be something to come at a later date, but regardless, I have seen the U.S. Army's own tech manual, video tech manual on the M115 howitzer. It's actually a really cool video, and I have the link in the video description below. And in that video, I don't see reference to this item over here. So is this something that the M115 howitzer had, or maybe had during World War II, and they dropped it in the 1950s, because that video that I'm mentioning is from the 1950s time frame. I'm not sure. Again, any red leg out there would point that out. Feel free to do so. It's always interesting to learn new stuff. However, in terms of the Aurora kit, it does supply you with this piece, and I went ahead and just rendered it in this format that we have here. Once that unit is in place, at this point here, the model is in transport mode, and I can just hitch it up to any type of prime mover. And if anyone's wondering, well, exactly what type of prime mover would you have? Well, Aurora themselves actually made an actual weapons carrier, which was a tracked vehicle. It's a really cool model in its own right. I have a couple in the stash. That's something I'm probably going to get to at a later date. But regardless, so that's, you know, something that is out there. Otherwise, you would have some kind of a prime mover. In World War II, they had turretless M10s that they left just for this type of a purpose. You had the M4 and the M5 high-speed tractor. Fortunately, I'm not sure if any of those are in 1/48 scale. I believe Bandai may have made those, which if they did, that's pretty cool. You can hitch it up to your Atlantis or Aurora M115. Or you can actually just use the... Actually, you know what? Hang on. I'll be right back and let me go ahead and get it. Aha! Quick cameo. I have it here hooked up to the 3D printed Cat D4 bulldozer model that I referenced in another model showcase video. But as you can see, something like this here definitely looks pretty cool and would be a nice little contender for someone's diorama setting, which, spoiler alert, I'll touch upon later in this video, is something that this kit here is extremely recommended for. But as I mentioned, even in the D4 video, bulldozers, or specifically military bulldozers, just give a nice little interesting edge to any diorama scene. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. And by the way, as a quick plug, if anyone is curious about this model over here, I have the video of this model showcase video in the link listed below, as well as also the link to find this model on Shapeways in case anyone's interested in hooking their model up to basically a setup like you see here. Hopping back to the seam removal, the other seam removal is something that's really important to note, and that is on the main carriage sections here on the sides, and also for the unit that holds the barrel in place. I did reference this briefly in the building portion of the video, but again, I have to stress it because it is extremely important to mention on these models, and this is true for not just the Atlantis one here, but it's also true for even the AFV Club. And I'm pretty sure the Tamiya M40 is the same way. This is something that definitely needs to be handled because if you have seams in these areas over here, it will basically be the detriment of your build and it will be one of the weakest aspects of it. Fortunately, the seams are relatively easily removed with a little bit of just, again, super glue and some sandpaper. So just a little bit of extra elbow grease is all that's required in order to just polish it down further to a point where it's seamless like you see on this example here. And that's really all there is to the model itself. Like I stated before, it's a fairly simple build in its own right, but it's one that goes together pretty well. And this basically leads us to the paint and the markings. For the model's paintwork, I went with a darker shade of olive drab, and this is something that I've used on a number of my other builds that have been posted on this channel in the past. This is I call it the late 40s 1950 shade of OD, and is my own custom mix. It's exterior latex, and of course it's applied via the airbrush. The weathering is all done with the use of washes, filters, and dry brushing techniques in order to get the worn look that we have here. The M115 was a unit that was utilized by the U.S. military as well as other militaries, but specifically in the U.S. for a number of decades, starting in World War II and retiring, I believe, what was it, the 80s or something along those lines. Regardless, it has a lot of options available for terms of paintwork. The reason why I went with the late 40s, 1950s shade of OD was actually, I guess, more or less a nod to the kit itself. I figured it would be appropriate to paint this model in this condition because, well, this was the era that this kit was designed in after all. And in combination with that, the markings that are supplied with the model are more or less what you would see on units from the Cold War time frame with the stars, and also with the way the nicknames are written on the side. It just seems to me more of a 1950s feel as opposed to something you would see on World War II. While on the topic of the markings, the decals that you see on this model here are the kit supplied water slide decals, and the quality on them were excellent. They are excellent decals. They went on without any sort of problems, and in order to secure them to the model, or preserve them to the model, I should say, the entire unit was coated in VMS matte varnish. I've utilized this product on a number of other builds in the past, and I always had some excellent results with them. The material is highly recommended. With the addition of the varnish, the decals are on in a nice flat manner, and also they don't have any sort of sheen or other type of imperfections that you tend to see on other poor quality markings. Overall, the decals on this kit here are excellently done. And in the end, I am really, really happy in how this build turned out. This was an excellent build. From start to finish, there were no surprises, no weird hangups, and for the most part, it was just a problem-free assembly. The model, like I mentioned before, is built predominantly out of the box. There's not really a whole lot that I did to this one, specifically if you compare and contrast this with some of the other Aurora or Atlantis builds that I've touched upon on this channel in the past, like the M46 Patton or the JS3. But for this one here, those extra add-ons weren't really that necessary. In my opinion, the kit is extremely well engineered and the model is very well thought out. What's interesting is that, just like what we see on many other kits from the vintage time frame, is they really incorporate a lot of detail elements as well as functionality and robustness into the build. And that is true for this one here as much as it's been for several of the other vintage kits that I've touched upon on this channel in the past. And yet, even though it has quite a bit of functionality features to it, it still goes together extremely easy and mostly effortlessly. Again, I don't know who was working on the design of this kit here, but they definitely must have had a little muse helping them out with the construction, because this kit was an absolute blast to work on. I normally don't really do a whole lot of towed artillery pieces on this channel, but this is something that I do dabble in from time to time, and I definitely do not regret the addition of this kit here to my collection. And I think that is the perfect place to segue us into skill level and recommendation. For skill level, this model here can be built by basically most modelers, from the beginner to the advanced. Obviously, a kit like this for an advanced builder, they may seem to feel that the kit is a bit overly simplistic for their taste. However, an advanced builder or an intermediate builder can definitely tackle one of these and do a pretty good job with it. A beginner can theoretically put one of these together. They are somewhat simplistic kits in their own right, with some major sub-assemblies to them that are pretty well thought out, but you do want to take your time when putting together some of these smaller components. Namely, the front wheel area, as I've touched upon before, it's quite a little bit of a jungle in there in terms of parts. Fortunately, there's not many parts, and they do go together pretty well. And because of the engineering that is found on the kit's tooling, I do believe a beginner can tackle one of these models if specifically you pay attention and watch out for some of the things that I touched upon earlier in this video. Swinging is directly into recommendations. This is where, in my opinion, this kit becomes very, very, very interesting. This model, as old as the tooling is is still just as relevant today in the year I'm filming this, which is 2022, as it was back in the 1950s when it was first developed. If you're looking for a 148 scale M115 howitzer for one reason or another, you're looking at it. This is literally the only one. Fortunately, the tooling that's found and the detail fidelity found on this kit here is pretty good, all things considered. The details are all there. It does have basically everything that would be found on the real M115 howitzer, albeit in a somewhat simplistic form in some areas here or there. However, the bare bones, the basis of this kit here is excellent. The geometry is where it needs to be. All the basic components are thoroughly represented, and this thing is a nice representation of an M115 howitzer. Just like what I've also mentioned in the other Aurora Park videos, 148 scale is one of those scales that goes in and out of vogue every so often. And again, we're basically on the threshold of 148 scale picking up again in popularity. And there's some pretty good reasons for that. 148 scale is a really cool scale. It's not nearly as large as its 135th scale cousins, but it's also a lot bigger compared to the 172. So it's kind of like right there in the middle. The models are, again, a decent size. They're not too big, which makes collecting them pretty easily done in that respect. You know, they don't take up too much shelf space. But another huge benefit that 148 scale that is not really present on 135 is with use in dioramas. Now, of course, 135th scale is really, really popular for diorama use, and there's a huge infrastructure for it, and that is true. However, unlike 135th scale, with 148 scale, you can also incorporate airplanes into your scene, as again, 148 scale is a humongously popular scale for aircraft model kits. And if you are the type of person that really likes to work on diorama scenes, well, 148 scale is definitely something to keep an eye on. And if you're looking for the addition of some kind of interesting howitzer type setup, well, this old school Atlantis reissue kit here is definitely something to pay attention to. Honestly, in my opinion, this kit's tooling aged so well that you can have a diorama depiction with this model in conjunction with one of the other more modern tooling kits, like from Trumpeter or Tamiya, or hell, even the older Bandai kits, and it will blend into the scene absolutely perfectly and will be the furthest thing from a detriment and will actually probably be a nice focal point for the setting. Of course, the model does have some areas where it could be improved, like, you know, with most things out there, but unlike some of the other kits on the market being 135th scale, where generally there's some kind of an aftermarket accessory that you can purchase to enhance the model further, either in photo etch or resin or 3D print these days. For this kit here, that's just not going to be an option. So if you do want to improve upon it further, obviously the model is a perfect canvas for that, but this is something that you are going to have to be digging into your skill sets and scratch building some of the other accessories or improvements that you deem fit for a project like this. In my opinion, the model is perfectly built just out of the box. It just aged very, very well in that regard. The other thing that I personally love about this kit is that it has so much functionality to it. You can have this model depicted in one of three different ways, or you can do like what I did here and basically have the model be able to transform into all three of them, which is something that's really, really cool. And with the way the original Aurora engineers designed the kit, they did a fantastic job with making the kit able to do that and also keeping it robust so you don't break something during the transformation process. Or, you know, within reason, I should say. And with that in mind, this also lends itself to just how adaptable this kit is, again, for just a diorama setting. You can have it in the deployed state like I have right here, or you can also have it in the transport state where it's being towed by some kind of a prime mover of one flavor or another. Aside from individuals who are into dioramas, I would strongly recommend this model for anyone who's an avid fan of just towed artillery pieces. There are lots of artillery kits on the market in a smattering of different scales from different genres, and this kit here would be a great addition to add to that collection. On a similar note, if you are the type of person who's just into collecting 148 scale military vehicles, like I just mentioned earlier with the dioramas, there are a number of 148 scale kits on the market. They are fairly popular, and if you're the type of person that's into collecting things in 148, the addition of this kit here is definitely another no-brainer. Another person who I'd recommend this kit to would be anyone who is into, well, building and collecting vintage plastic tank model kits. Basically, like yours truly. For the longest period of time, this kit here would have been one of those grail kits that you would find tucked away in a enclave of some antique shop or something, because like I stated earlier, the Aurora kits were always super collectible to find, and when found, specifically during my youth, they were very, very expensive. Well, with the Atlantis reissues over here, you get literally the Aurora kit just resurrected, and it's not just more available, but it's also at a fraction of the price of the original OG Aurora one. So if you're looking to scratch that Aurora itch, but you don't want to dump an original Aurora price tag on one of these older models for collector value, well, then the Atlantis one here is a perfect way to do so. Also, there's a little bit of a guilt-free thing, because a lot of those older Aurora kits, specifically the ones that are still mint in the box, you kind of feel bad if you want to crack one open and build it. And the Atlantis reissue over here, it's a very guilt-free experience where you could have the model, enjoy it, build it to your heart's content, and fear not of any depreciation value on the model once it is in its built form. And while I'm on this roll, I might as well say that I cannot recommend this kit enough to anyone who's an older individual who built one of these kits back in the day. If you did and, yours didn't survive, either your mom threw it out when you went off to college, or you blew it up with a firecracker, or let's just say you still have your old school one, but you just want to relive the experience of building one of these older school kits, well, the Atlantis kits here obviously cannot be recommended enough. They are a nice welcome mat back into the hobby where they pat you on the back and tell you everything's going to be okay. Only hopefully this time you won't use Tesser's Red Tube Model Glue, and you'll probably do a better job with the build the second or fifth or 10th time around. A lot of guys built a lot of these Aurora kits back in the day. Also, on a similar note, if you're the type of person that has either a child or a grandchild or a nephew or something along those lines, and you're looking for a fun, cool afternoon project to share together, these Atlantis kits here are absolutely perfect for that. They build well, they build fairly easily, they build very quickly, and on top of that, they are relatively affordable and available. All of those tick the boxes for a nice experience to share with a younger individual. And with that, that wraps up this episode of Aurora Park. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small-scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or the other larger-scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Take care.